Coming up on this Friday edition of Daybreak, President Park Geun-hye appoints 4 senior secretaries as part of a reshuffle aimed at reforming the government and repairing her administration's image in the wake of the recent ferry disaster. Korea's export prices fall to their lowest point in almost 6.5 years in May as the local currency rallied to new heights against the US dollar. Plus, the 2014 World Cup kicks off with the opening match between the host nation Brazil and Croatia. Daybreak begins now. Hello and thanks for joining us. To our viewers around the world, it's 6 a.m. on Friday, June 13th. Here in Seoul, I'm Mark Broom and you are tuned in to Daybreak. Our top story this morning, President Park Geun-hye has replaced 4 of her senior secretaries in the presidential office. The move is designed, her office says at least, to push forward with the president's government and economic reforms. Choi You-sun starts us off.
President Park has named Gender Equality Minister and former ruling Saenuri Party lawmaker Cho Yoon-sun as Secretary for Political Affairs. It's the first time a woman has been named to the post. The presidential office expects Cho's parliamentary and government experience to help her act as a bridge between the two sides. Ruling party lawmaker An Chong-bum was named Secretary for Economic Affairs. The tax, finance, and welfare expert played a key role in devising the president's election pledges. He is considered the right choice to lead the president's 3-year plan to revitalize the local economy. Former prosecutor Kim Young-han was appointed Secretary for Civil Affairs. Citing his contributions to establish law and order, the presidential office expects Kim to restore discipline in public service and to deliver public opinion to the president without filters. And former president of Seoul National University of Education Song Kwang-yong was appointed Secretary for Education and Culture. The president's close aide will likely be given the task of not only reforming the country's education system, but relaying the president's policies to the recently elected progressive education superintendents. While replacing half of her secretaries with close aides, President Park has confirmed confidence in the chief of staff, who has been criticized for the presidential office's recent series of personnel appointment failures and the government's lax response to April's ferry disaster. What's expected now is a reshuffling of the president's cabinet. While that announcement will likely come before President Park's overseas trip next week, uncertainties linger as controversy mounts over the credentials of her prime minister nominee. Choi You-sun, Arirang News.
Now, following up on the reshuffle of her close aides, President Park is expected to announce her cabinet shakeup later on this Friday. The timing was revealed during presidential spokesman Min Kyung-uk's press briefing Thursday when he reported on the president's new secretaries. This will be the 3rd part of the president's shakeup, coming after the nomination of the prime minister and the appointment of her senior secretaries. 7 ministers are expected to be replaced, including the heads of the finance, securities and education ministries. President Park's close aide and former ruling party floor leader Choi You-sun is likely to be nominated as the nation's finance minister, and this post also acts as the deputy prime minister. Officials say the cabinet reshuffle, coming before the president's trip to Central Asia next week, reflects her intent to quickly normalize government operations after the Seoul-Ho ferry disaster. Staying with domestic politics, and it didn't take too long for controversy to erupt around President Park's second pick for her new prime minister. Just days after his nomination was announced, Moon Chang-guk finds himself in the middle of a political firestorm concerning some very controversial public statements he made a few years ago. Na Hyung-kyung reports.
During a lecture at his church 3 years ago, Prime Minister nominee Moon Chang-guk said Japan's forced colonization of the Korean peninsula in the early 20th century was part of God's will to awaken the Korean people. He added God also divided the two Koreas and that if the Korean peninsula had been an independent state at the time, the South would have settled on communism. At a lecture the following year, the nominee put his ultra-right views on display again, saying Korea was able to enjoy economic development by adopting technologies from Japan during the colonial era, adding that it was a geopolitical blessing from God. He also said Korea was liberated from Japan not because of the people's independence movement, but because it was granted to Koreans by the will of God. In response, ruling Saenuri Party floor leader Lee Won-gu said he believes the comments were not ill-intended, but a small group of junior lawmakers from the ruling party has called on Moon to step down. The opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy's co-leader An Chol-su also called on President Park to withdraw Moon's nomination, saying it will be the right decision if she doesn't share his views. The man in question said it was regrettable that his comments were misinterpreted, but at the same time seemed firm that he had no intention of apologizing. 나현경, Arirang News.
Now, the new floor leader of Korea's main opposition party has called on Parliament to concentrate all of their efforts on improving inter-Korean relations and carrying out sweeping government reforms. Our political correspondent Ji Myung-gil reports.
Addressing a full National Assembly on Thursday, Park Geun-hye, floor leader of the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy, called for an inter-Korean summit as soon as possible.
The National Assembly should create a special committee that will focus on preparing an environment for peaceful reunification of the Korean peninsula.
Park also called for reviving past agreements with North Korea, such as the September 19th joint statement of 2005, which calls on Pyongyang to give up its nuclear programs in exchange for economic and political concessions. The floor leader also pushed once again for a thorough investigation into April's ferry disaster.
An investigation without boundaries is the order from the people. The very first task for the National Assembly in the second half of the year is to conduct a thorough probe into the Saenuri ferry tragedy.
Park made a case for comprehensive reforms in the government and parliament, saying failures in the government system were one of the causes of the accident. She also sounded the alarm about the nation's aging nuclear power plants.
A nuclear power plant disaster is like an atomic bomb. The nuclear industry has been tarnished with corruption scandals, which sets the stage for a major accident like the ferry disaster.
The main opposition floor leader called for anti-corruption bills targeting high-ranking government officials to be swiftly passed at the National Assembly. She said that Korea's bureaucrats have long enjoyed landing jobs after retirement at companies and public institutions, which has contributed to the lax management of safety regulations. Park also pledged that the main opposition alliance would make Korea a better place to live by reducing youth unemployment, household debt, and the growing social income gaps. Ji Myung-gil, Arirang News.
North Korea has received an even sweeter offer from Japan to restart its investigation into the abduction of Japanese nationals in the late 1970s and early 80s. Japan's Chief Cabinet Secretary Yoshihide Suga said Thursday that Tokyo would lift sanctions against North Korea as soon as Pyongyang launches a special reinvestigation committee on the abduction issue. This, in fact, differs from the original promise made late last month when Japan said it would lift 3 sanctions at an unspecified time against North Korea. The sanctions include a travel ban between the two countries, a ban on money transfers, and the prohibition on North Korean ships' entry into Japanese ports. North Korea admitted in 2002 that it had abducted 13 Japanese nationals, but Japan claims many more were in fact kidnapped. Korea is once again calling on Japan to acknowledge the so-called comfort women issue and make an official apology to the victims. Speaking at the Ending Sexual Violence in Conflict Summit in London on Thursday, Korea's second Vice Foreign Minister, Jo Tae-yeol, said the horrific crime of Japan's sexual slavery should never be repeated, and the Japanese government should swiftly take action to settle the issue. The minister added that in order to end wartime sexual violence, world governments, international organizations and civic groups need to come together, work together. Under the slogan, Time to Act, the four-day summit plans to come up with practical measures to prevent wartime sexual violence and expand international support for the victims.
We start before the sun rises to bring you the latest stories out of Korea. We also lead the way with important global coverage. Stay on the pulse of what is happening with Daybreak.
The Bank of Korea kept its key rate at 2.5% for the 13th straight month. In June, the central bank says it's keeping a close eye on the impact of the ferry disaster back in April. Park Geun-hye has this report.
Concerns over the ferry tragedy in April are spreading as it's slowing down the pace of Korea's economic recovery. While deciding to keep the key rate steady at 2.5% this month, Governor Lee Ju-yeol said Thursday that Korea's central bank is keeping a close eye on whether the ferry disaster will have a long-term impact.
If domestic demand picks up in the near future, I believe the economy will grow as we expected. We are closely monitoring the possibility that the ferry disaster will have a negative impact going forward for a longer period of time.
In its latest growth forecast, the central bank said the domestic economy will grow 4% this year. Based on the circumstances of the outlook, Lee made it clear that any future monetary decision would include a rate hike. Nomura analyst Michael Na, however, downplayed concerns of the ferry disaster and said the current key rate is very accommodative for the economy.
Export has picked up, but recently because of the ferry disaster, it seems like things have sort of halted, but I think that's only a temporary issue.
Na added that there could be a rate hike in the cards for Asia's fourth largest economy, which is heavily dependent on exports.
We do think that the global economy recovery is starting to accelerate, and we think that a timing of a rate hike will be sometime in first half next year.
Now, all eyes are on the central bank's next move in July when it will release a new growth outlook and give a clearer indication for the path of a rate change. 황지혜, Arirang News.
Now, as the Korean won continues to gain strength, the country's export prices fell to their lowest levels in well over 6 years in May, and this trend is likely to prevail for the time being. Our Yulian reports.
Korean exporters saw their profitability decline for the third straight month in May as export prices fell to their lowest level since December 2007. The figure stood at 86.8, which is a drop of 1.6% from the previous month, according to the Bank of Korea. That means exporters were earning that much less when shipping out the same amount of products. The drop is attributed to the strengthening Korean won. The won rose 2% against the greenback last month when Korea posted a sizable current account for the 26th straight month. Foreign stock investors also helped push the value of the won higher as they brought the Korean currency to buy local shares seen as safe investment. Experts say the won is expected to keep strengthening against the dollar in coming months, given that the United States has no plan to increase interest rates anytime soon. Even then, they don't see any major decline in the country's exports.
A growing number of exporters, particularly conglomerates, have grown largely immune to currency fluctuations. And research results since 2000 show that the country's exports are not negatively affected by exchange rate changes. So I don't see much immediate impact on exports from a stronger won.
Ha adds, however, it's a different story for export-dependent small to medium-sized companies whose profitability has worsened since the global financial crisis in 2008. That could signal a widening gap between mid-sized businesses and conglomerates. Yurian, Arirang News.
Now, Korea's biggest company, Samsung, is still going very, very strong. When it comes to net sales, Samsung Electronics finds itself at the top of the global ladder. An annual report from Deloitte, which tracked the sales of 250 global consumer product companies, shows that the Korean tech giant raked in about $179 billion in sales around the world in 2012, the second straight year that Samsung came in at number one. It was followed by Apple and Nestle. LG Electronics also cracked the top 10 with net sales of about $45 billion. Perception doesn't always match up to reality, and that holds true for the perception of middle-class living here in Korea. A new survey of more than 800 people conducted by the Hyundai Research Institute shows that Koreans believe you're a member of the middle class if you earn about $5,000 a month and own a house over 115 square meters in size. In reality, their median monthly income, the middle class that is, stood at around $4,000, and they own a house totaling about 70 square meters. The Research Institute said Korean society needs to close the gap between perception and reality by improving the general quality of life.
And TGI Friday, everyone, as we kick things off with the opening ceremony, which kicked off the 2014 Brazil World Cup as the ceremony took place at the Corinthians Arena in Sao Paulo. And of course, with thousands of fans at the stadium, there were some interesting performances to kick off the 2014 Brazil World Cup, including rapper Pitbull and singer J-Lo. Not only that, some unique acts during the opening ceremony, which took place just before the first match between Brazil and Croatia. But most interesting part of the ceremony has to be a paraplegic taking the first kick in an Iron Man-like suit. And of course, at 5 p.m. local time or 5 a.m. Korea time, Brazil kicked off the tournament with their match against Croatia for their Group A matchup. And not the best start for Brazil, as Marcelo in the 11th minute scored an own goal, giving Croatia the early 1-0 lead. But Neymar answers back in the 29th minute, scoring a brilliant goal to make it 1-1. And currently in the second half, the score is still 1-1. So now that the 2014 Brazil World Cup has kicked off, we can look forward to the South Korean national football team trying to advance from Group H. But after two heartbreaking losses, what do they need to do? Of course, we talked about the different formations, and manager Hong Myung-bo likes to utilize the 4-2-3-1 formation and can even switch the 4-4-2 formation, so can't change that. But what the players really need to work on is their confidence, and this is especially for their offense. Now, aside from Son Heung-min, many of the players can be seen trying to make sure they have the perfect angle before making each shot, and by then it's too late. And the defense, keep mentioning this, but they really need to communicate more and focus more. Of course, the number one priority is having that confidence. And now finishing things off, without the Seoul City Hall available to the Red Devil supporter group for the World Cup venue for the street cheering, that was the issue. But it looks like they finally have a venue now. Of course, with the Seoul City Hall being used as one of the memorial sites for the Seoho ferry victims, the Gwanghwamun Square in central Seoul was initially rejected by the city officials due to safety concerns. However, on Thursday, it was announced that the Gwanghwamun Square will be used as the main venue, with the officials set to finalize everything soon. Meanwhile, the city officials added that safety will be the most important thing.
Well, thank you very much there to SJ for the World Cup update. Now, as we mentioned, the 2014 World Cup kicked off a little over an hour ago with the opening match between the host country Brazil and Croatia. As SJ mentioned, it's still 1-1 in that game. Our Song Ji-sun has a wrap-up of the history of the tournament, how this year's Korean squad might fare, and how the Korean economy stands to benefit from the global event.
The World Cup is back in the country that has won the trophy 5 times already. With Europe taking the past 2 World Cup trophies, South American footballers are eager to bring it back home. But how will Team Korea fare? Looking at past World Cups, they presented us with the miracle of finishing 4th at the World Cup held at home back in 2002, but they haven't been so brilliant since. In Brazil, their first match against Russia will be pivotal to boost the team's confidence and to earn game points ahead of Belgium and Algeria. As all matches are scheduled to start in the early morning hours here in Korea,
it will be difficult for a lot of people to watch them along with friends and some cold beverages, like in years past. While restaurants and bars may not be seeing much of a rise in revenue, television manufacturers stand to benefit as people take this as an opportunity to upgrade their TVs so they can watch the games in higher definition in the comfort of their own homes. But of course, the official sponsors will likely see the biggest returns. Hyundai Motor Group is the only automaker among the 6 FIFA partners, and to maximize their return on investment, the World Cup itself must be a hit in terms of viewer ratings.
Both the US and Europe have less than a 4-hour time difference with Brazil. That makes it easier to attract potential market consumers to watch the games. Hyundai and Kia Motors have been launching new models in the US and Europe from March to July, which can maximize the promotional effect coupled with the World Cup.
Analysis by Hyundai and Samsung Research Institute suggests that if Korea advances to round of 16, the nation can expect $1.3 billion worth of brand publicity. But if they don't make it past the group stage, the effect will be a mere $450,000. 송지선, Arirang News.
Time now for a look through the international headlines we're following this morning. For that, we turn to our Eunice Kim, standing by at the News Center. Good morning, Eunice.
Good morning, Mark. Now, on the growing Sunni insurgency in Iraq, we are getting some reaction from Washington. U.S. President Barack Obama says all options are on the table, including military options, to help the Iraqi government fight the militants. He said he's not ruling anything out because the U.S. has a stake in making sure that the jihadists don't get a permanent foothold in either Iraq or Syria. The statement came in response to questions on whether airstrikes were a possibility. The White House later clarified it had no intention of sending in ground troops. Fighting continues on the ground as Baghdad's forces continue. And on the heels of that, U.S. President Joe Biden is said to have told Iraq's Maliki that the U.S. is prepared to accelerate military support. It's not yet time to bring in peacekeepers into Ukraine, this according to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov said everything is in the hands of Ukrainian authorities and that hope still exists behind Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko's promise to end the violence and start negotiations. Russia will, however, submit another draft resolution on Ukraine to the UN Security Council on the alarm at the lack of progress to reach those ends. This as Secretary General of the OSCE Lamberto Zanier is to head to Russia's Rostov region to visit a Ukrainian refugee camp there. Lavrov expressed his support of the OSCE's roadmap for Ukraine and urged the Intergovernmental Security Organization to make its work more concrete. A Pakistani court has approved former military leader Pervez Musharraf's request to leave the country, removing him from the government's exit control list, which had banned him from overseas travel. Musharraf is currently on trial for treason, a charge he has rejected as politically motivated. There has been no reaction from the government so far. It has a window of 15 days to appeal before the court order comes into effect. Watchers say the case could set a precedent for a country with a history of military rule. And finally, half of all deaths of children under 5 years of age is caused by malnutrition, according to a new report by the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. That amounts to more than 3 million children every year, while some 162 million are left stunted by chronic malnutrition. Important advances have been made in the fight against hunger since the early 1990s, FAO's head said, but the progress has been insufficient and uneven. On the other side of the spectrum, some 500 million children are said to be obese.
Good morning. I'm Lee Ji-hyun with your weather updates. It was Daejeon area where received a sudden downpour yesterday, and it seems like on and off showers along with thunder and lightning continue to sweep the peninsula, and it could be hailing in some areas today. And we should be able to enjoy somewhat cool and fresh readings across the region, topping out in the mid-20s in most areas. With that in mind, let's take a closer look at the readings for today. The low in Seoul is starting out at 18 and the high will rise to 26, while Daegu tops out at 28 and Busan should climb to 25 later on. For other regions, down on Jeju should see a high of 25. Daejeon and Dokdo will reach 26 and 19 respectively. Well, that's all for now, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
And those are the stories we have for you at this hour. Korea Today is coming up in about half an hour's time, and we'll be back at the same time on Monday. Until then, goodbye.